I'm Maryn McKenna. As you heard, I am an independent journalist, a board member of the AHCJ, and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. And I am thrilled to introduce our keynote guest, Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health, who has been director since 2009, and before that was director of the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH. Dr. Collins is a physician and a geneticist and is familiar to everyone now, I think, for the intense interest that the entire world has in the research that the National Institutes of Health is supporting into a vaccine against COVID-19. I'm going to bring in Dr. Collins, and he's going to speak to us for just a couple of minutes about what is going on right now, and then we're going to fire at him a number of questions that have been submitted by members of the organization and members of the audience. Dr. Collins, thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much, Maryn. It's wonderful to be with all of you for a little bit here to talk about where science is going and trying to tackle this very significant challenge of COVID-19. I have my little model of this guy here that I've been prone to call, maybe this is the nanoscale Death Star of our time. And our goal is to figure out how to keep this nasty virus from doing even more harm than it already has. We are right now at a moment of dramatic contrast. As I will say in a minute, science is coming forward in really remarkable ways, particularly in the area of vaccines, but also in terms of therapeutics and diagnostics. At the same time, our country is witnessing a really frightening uptick in cases, hospitalizations, and now more recently deaths as well, worse than we have seen at any time since this pandemic first emerged back in January. So we have a lot of things that need to happen in terms of public health measures while we are waiting for the full benefits of the vaccines to come forward. Very quickly, I think all of you have heard that in just the last 10 days, two companies, Pfizer and Moderna, have announced the results of interim analysis of their vaccine phase 3 trials, and Pfizer announced their final data just yesterday. And the news is extremely good. Both of these involving trials of 30,000 or more participants have been able to show that the messenger RNA-based vaccine strategy has resulted in over 90% efficacy for both of these, and what appears to be a very reasonable safety record as well. FDA must now look at the emergency use authorization applications from both of these companies, which they will be doing intensively in the next 3 weeks. And then there is a fairly reasonable likelihood that EUAs will be issued to these vaccines and immunization can begin, recognizing that we don't have enough doses right away for the entire country or the entire world. So in December, something like 20 million people will be able to be immunized with one or the other of these vaccines in the United States, and a lot of effort being put in place to manage the distribution and also to set the priorities appropriately so that the highest risk individuals are first in line. On top of what's happened in vaccines, and there are 4 other vaccines right behind these two that we can talk about, all supported by Operation Warp Speed, there's also been progress in therapeutics. We have remdesivir, we have dexamethasone, we have baricitinib that was just approved by the FDA today. We also have, as an emergency use authorization, approval of a monoclonal antibody from Lilly, which seems to be effective for outpatients, but not for hospitalized patients, and another application for another monoclonal antibody cocktail from Regeneron that is under review. So a lot of progress in that space. And finally, before I take what questions you all have, NIH is also very engaged in trying to develop additional diagnostic technologies, particularly those that can be applied as point of care, in order to make it possible to do much more widespread surveillance of asymptomatic individuals in order to identify those who are carrying the virus, maybe without realizing it, but who could be contagious to those around them. And we are seeing, and just in the course of the last few months, because of some additional congressional funding, no less than 22 new diagnostic technology platforms, which collectively by December will add another 2 million tests per day to our nation's capability, doubling what we currently have. And of course, there's a big discussion about how best to deploy that kind of testing capability and also how to pay for it. So between diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, this has been the most amazing outpouring of scientific capabilities, determination, talent that I've ever seen in my 27 years at NIH. I'm speaking to you from my home office, where I've pretty much been running a $42 billion a year organization called NIH since last March. But the willingness of people to come together and drop everything and work 24/7 and not worry who's going to get the credit, building collaborations across academia, government, and industry has been truly gratifying. And there will be a very wonderful story to write about that if we ever have time. So thanks very much for the chance to be here. And Maryn, I'll let you now move us into the interactive part of this conversation.
Dr. Collins, thanks so much. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that Dr. Collins only has half an hour with us. So we now have about 25 minutes to get as many questions to him as possible. The one that I want to ask first, before I get into the many detailed questions that people have sent to us, is I wonder if you could just reflect for a moment about really how extraordinary this is. I mean, we have, December 30th last year was the first that the world knew of an infection spreading in China. It was January before we knew it was a coronavirus. And yet here we are, less than a year into that span, with an emergency use authorization for possibly 2 vaccines in sight. This has never been done before.
It is absolutely extraordinary, and let nobody really minimize the amazing things that made that possible. If you look historically, what's the timetable for developing a vaccine against a new pathogen? On the average, it's about 8 years. And those generally are based upon trials that we thought were large in the past, of maybe 5,000 individuals or even less. Here we are in 10 months. With these 2 trials, each of which involved at least 30,000 participants in phase 3. And on top of that, because of Operation Warp Speed, we already have millions of doses of both of those vaccines ready to be deployed if FDA approves them, which usually would have been another many months of building the factory and trying to make the doses to deliver. So yes, this is unprecedented in so many ways. And talk about pulling all hands on deck and also corralling a lot of resources. The U.S. government's put about $10 billion into this through Warp Speed. Thank you, taxpayers, because that's how this happened. And without that, none of these things could have happened in this speed. The one slight downside to this is that it's caused people to worry that we're going so fast that we're calling it Warp Speed, which was maybe not the best choice of a label. And that is causing some public anxiety about whether corners are being cut and maybe this isn't going to turn out to be safe or it isn't going to be effective. I just want to reassure everybody, and I hope you all as journalists can do so also, that everything in this situation is being done with the highest possible rigor, and there are no corners being cut, and all of the judgments are being made by independent scientists and not on the basis of politics.
So I think we really should jump into that right away. Could you just clarify the timeline for us? I know there was a fair amount of discussion earlier on in the year about how it would be necessary to have 2 full months of safety data as well as efficacy in order to get the vaccine approved. Are you confident that we are about to reach that point? Is the safety data in, or will that be after the EUAs are awarded?
I give FDA a lot of credit for setting clear guidelines about what their expectations were going to be for the safety and the efficacy data, and not leaving that to chance or to some concerns about political manipulation. They just put it out there. And they said basically they needed to see 2 months worth of follow-up on at least half of the participants in the trial in order to assess safety. This is going to turn out just about right, because Pfizer and Moderna will both hit that 2-month period in the course of the next couple of weeks. So even as FDA is already starting to review their applications in terms of the data that they have, that can be quickly updated, and it will not slow down the process of making a decision. It's all coming together really well.
So I really would like to hear you talk for just a moment or two more about this challenge of messaging to the public that all of that data is going to be in, that that regulators are confident about the safety of the vaccines. What is it that you think should be emphasized? And your audience is journalists. What is it we should be saying to people?
Well, first of all, I don't in any way want to put down the concerns that people have had about how this process is going. It doesn't help to just say to people, oh, you're just being silly about this. People do have legitimate concerns about whether this is being done right. And of course, there's been a lot of noise and concern that the timelines might be driven by politics instead of by science. They have been driven entirely by science, I can promise you that. And of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are out there, and people who get information from social media may have all kinds of misconceptions about exactly what has happened here or what might be going on that isn't quite right. So we have some work to do to kind of replace those maybe somewhat nebulous concerns and some conspiracy misconceptions with the facts. But the good news is the facts are coming forward. And I have a lot of trust in Americans that once there's real factual evidence that is readily digestible, they're going to be able to kind of put the reset button in place here and push it and say, okay, let's really look and see what the evidence is for or against my rolling up my sleeve. And I think the evidence will be compelling that this has been done in the right way scientifically. And we have a good chance, therefore, of taking the roughly 50% of Americans that are not at all sure they want this vaccine and asking them to have another look. But that's going to take a lot of voices, and not just people like me. I mean, here I am, this guy from the federal government. Of course, I'm going to say this is going to be a really good thing. But what about voices from the healthcare profession? People need to hear from their own doctor that this is something that can be trusted. They need to hear from other community spokespersons. We need to get that kind of messaging going very vigorously. And I think this is the right time because people are hearing, oh, wow, it sounds like these vaccines are coming even sooner than some had thought, and it sounds like they might be pretty good. Tell me more. And we want to be able to tell them more in a fashion that is interpretable, that's honorable, that's completely what we know and what we don't know, and coming from multiple different perspectives and not just people who would be presumed potentially to have a conflict of interest because they want this to work. So it can't just be the government, it can't just be industry, it's got to be other voices too.
As you know, because these events occurred within your public life as a scientist, there have been very large vaccine campaigns in the past in response to outbreaks. I'm thinking of the 1976 swine flu vaccination and also the H1N1 flu vaccination in 2009, where some side effects did not appear until very large volumes of vaccine were rolled out. Guillain-Barré in the United States in 1976 and narcolepsy in Europe in 2009 and 10. What can you say to increase the comfort of people who are apprehensive that it's only when we deliver very large volumes of vaccine that we'll start to see some potential dangers emerge?
Well, I think we have to be completely direct in addressing that and saying we do what we can in the process of running a very large phase 3 trial to look for any of those safety signals, and we have done so. But that does not absolutely rule out the possibility that a 1 in a million event might not happen because we are not able to test 1 million people in the trials. So we should all be aware that there is a non-zero possibility of rare side effects that did not emerge in the trial. They would need to be rare or we would know about them. And everybody who's trying to consider whether or not to roll up their sleeve has to think about that risk versus the risk of getting infected with this virus that has now killed almost 250,000 people. And I think reasonable people putting those two things next to each other would still say it's probably worth taking that small risk of an unappreciated side effect in order to save myself, my family, from what otherwise might be a terrible outcome.
Do you have any thoughts at this point about the challenges of getting the vaccine out to populations that might not have been well represented in the trials, whether that's racial and ethnic minorities or older people or pregnant women or children, and how that part of the rollout is going to go?
That's a great question. I am very concerned and very motivated to be sure that in the trials themselves, we make sure we have enrolled those who maybe have taken the most severe burden from this virus upon themselves and their communities, African Americans, Latinx, Native Americans. We worked intensively with Moderna on this enrollment process because they were part of the NIH effort from the beginning. I ran a Saturday 10 a.m. conference call every weekend starting in July with the leadership of Moderna and Warp Speed and NIH. And the main topic was try to boost the diversity in their enrollment so that we would be able to say, did this vaccine work for African Americans? Did it work for people over 65? Did it work for Latinx or people who were younger but had a chronic illness? So we had very bold goals there, and it was tough. It was not a straightforward issue, especially reaching out to minorities who were skeptical about this, and have a reason to be, given the history of the ways in which researchers have not always treated minorities with respect. Tuskegee still resonates with a lot of people. But with that effort, putting together something called SEAL, Community Engagement Alliance, building upon NIH community relationships and other kinds of clinical trials, we gradually, over time, got better and better, and that Moderna trial now includes 37% people of color, which is drastically better than the default would have been if that effort had not gone. I hope that will be looked at, and people will say, oh, this really was tried out on a wide array of people, and it worked for them, so maybe it will work for me too. But we, again, have a particularly heavy load of responsibilities there to get that message out from trusted voices, and that might not be the government or industry. That might be the doc that you know. It might be your church leaders who can look at the evidence and say, we don't want to be left out of this. This is a chance to save our communities too. We also have for diagnostics a program called RADx for underserved populations, rapid acceleration of diagnostics, because that's another place where underserved populations have not had the same access to testing. And if we really want to try to do everything we can to prevent illnesses, we also need to be able to identify those who are infected and quickly get them isolated. And that means making that point of care technology accessible to those communities that sometimes have been left out. In all of those ways, we are really trying to take this moment where a bright light is being shown on health disparities in our country and do something pretty bold and important about changing that, and hopefully we'll learn those lessons for the future.
I do just want to remind the audience, for those who are sort of new to reporting on this, that the reason that you're talking so much about the trial composition for Moderna is that Moderna was part of the Warp Speed effort, whereas Pfizer was not, though of course Pfizer is involved with the federal government since it had a big contract with the federal government last summer, I believe, or this past summer for the vaccine. So the federal government is around all of this.
Yeah, just to clarify, Pfizer wanted to run their own trial. They did not accept federal support for the trial itself, but they have now contracted with the government for manufacturing 100 million doses and figuring out the distribution of those. So they are part of Warp Speed, but in a different way. The other 5 vaccine trials that are part of Warp Speed are also having support for their trials, as Moderna did, and they are running through a DSMB, a Data Safety Monitoring Board, that is shared amongst all of those, and they're using a harmonized protocol developed by NIH in association with industry in a partnership called ACTIVE, the Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines Partnership, which is another amazing and unique and never before attempted partnership that has made a lot of things happen that otherwise would have taken maybe months or years and happened in weeks.
So I want to circle back to some of the numbers you quoted at us when you began speaking. It's really extraordinary to think that 20 million people might be in the first tranche of that. Did I get that right? 20 million people, 40 million doses? Yeah.
In December.
And yet, of course, that's only a fraction of the population. So can you talk for a bit about how you expect the vaccine to roll out in the different stages or tranches that the CDC has identified, what those numbers might look at and how long it might take?
Yeah, I can try, although it is a little bit less certain as you project past the first couple of months. But certainly in January, we expect there would be another 40 million doses combined between Pfizer and Moderna, maybe a little bit more if they can ramp up the manufacturing. Meanwhile, there are these other 4 vaccines, 2 of which are now in the midst of intensive enrollment. And if all goes well, they might then be reaching the point by January or early February of getting their data together. If, for instance, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, the two that are currently running large-scale trials, do also get approval, that'll help because they have also had millions of doses being manufactured in advance of approval. This is sort of at-risk manufacturing as part of Warp Speed. And that would help a lot in terms of increasing the total number of doses that can be delivered. The Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine will be particularly easier to deal with as far as distribution because it's a single dose instead of 2 doses. And it also has a very gentle cold chain requirement. So it would help a lot if we could add that to the mix. But certainly over the course then of January, February, on into the spring, more and more doses will become available. Distribution will be done according to the recommendations about priorities, and the CDC's group called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will be making those recommendations pretty soon. But when do we get to the point where 80% of Americans have been immunized, which is where you could really expect to see this epidemic fade away? Probably not until the summer, if all goes well. And that will, of course, depend upon Americans deciding they want the vaccine. One of the greatest tragedies you can imagine in our technological society will be if the science says we could get there and we have the doses and a significant proportion of Americans turn them down, and then this epidemic goes on and on and on. I dearly hope that's not what we're looking at.
So given the timeline that you've just sketched out, I wonder if you could talk for just a minute about how the vaccine, as exciting as it is not the sole answer to the situation that we are in at the moment, that we'll still need to go on with non-pharmaceutical interventions of social distancing and sequestering at home, and also that we'll have to treat people with the new therapeutics you talked about in order when they get sick before this vaccine arrives.
Well, that's very much where we are right now. The vaccines, although they hopefully are giving people a sense that this is not going to go on forever, and maybe that will inspire people to double down on the kind of public health measures that maybe we were all getting a little tired of and say, we can do this, we can get through this. And boy, is it important right now with Thanksgiving and other holidays looming for people to take this with even more seriousness, especially as the virus is spreading really almost in every state and in a frightening way. When you look at the shape of that upward curve, when you see in some states that the percent of tests that are positive is over 10%, at least in one state over 50%, this is out of control. And as much as we'd like to think the vaccine's going to help, it won't be in time for that. We know how to do this. We've seen in Arizona in the past, and a nice example in Delaware, and we've seen in Europe, who was a couple weeks ahead of us. They've managed to get that curve to flatten out by introducing really rigorous public health measures of mask wearing, social distancing, not gathering indoors, basically requiring the bars to either limit their hours or close down, limiting a restaurant indoor dining as well, all the places where we know this could happen, and also convincing people to really limit their own social gatherings, and that's going to be important for Thanksgiving. I'm not going to have Thanksgiving this year with my family. First time in 27 years. It'll be my wife and me on a Zoom call with kids and grandkids, seeing how everybody's doing. It's just too risky with people traveling around the country and not knowing who is actually infected. And having them gather around the Thanksgiving table is the worst thing you could probably do right now in most parts of the country. So, yeah, it's going to be up to all of us. And we've got to get past this idea that wearing a mask is some sort of a statement. A mask is not a signal of losing your personal freedom. Or is it a signal of your limited masculinity or femininity? It's basically a life-saving medical device. Think of it that way. Now, wouldn't you, if you had friends or family who were at risk for something terrible happening, wouldn't you want to help them, do anything you could in that kind of trouble? Well, we're all in trouble, and we all have something to do. Use your medical device. It's called a mask. And let's put it on, America, and let's try not to, layer on top of that all sorts of other things that don't belong there, like politics. That would help a lot. I know from some of the predictions we could save maybe 100,000 lives if we just decided to do this universally. And it's gratifying to see many states that were resistant in the past now recognizing this. But basically, it's one thing for state leadership. It's really up to all Americans to figure out how to do this themselves. And again, maybe now that this has gotten so severe, people would be willing to rethink their resistance. If you put on your seatbelt in the car, same kind of idea. Seatbelts save 15,000 lives every year. Wearing your mask could save a lot more than that. Why would you not do that if you put on your seatbelt? It's the same thing.
We hope there will come a time, since we just have a couple more minutes with you, there's just two more questions I want to ask you. We hope there will come a time when COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, is vanquished or at least becomes sort of the part of the background endemic pattern of our lives. When that happens, will this experience have changed the National Institutes of Health? Has it changed how you do business? It changed your priorities? Will the agency be different going forward?
We will be different in lots of different ways. I mean, one is we will basically figure out there's a lot of things that we've been able to do virtually that have actually worked pretty well. And, you know, like peer review panels, which used to be all done face-to-face and have now been completely done virtually. There's a time where it's good to have everybody in the same room, but there's a lot of times where it works just fine with a Zoom connection. So we'll be doing things like that just in terms of our operations, but also just in terms of how we do science. The ability to pull together this active partnership that I mentioned, 20 pharmaceutical companies, the government, multiple academic centers. We put that together in 2 weeks. Normally that would have been like years and, you know, legions of lawyers. And it was like, no, well, this is important. We'll figure out how to do it. We'll not worry about the IP. And we did it. And I don't want to hear anybody tell me in the future that's not possible, because we have done the experiment and it worked. So likewise, what we did with diagnostics, we got funds for that. And 5 days later, we set up, which is basically kind of a venture capital operation for the government to identify those creative innovators in small businesses and academics who had a great idea about diagnostics and needed some resources and some evaluation and a Shark Tank to help them figure out how to make it work. And we did that. And now we have 2 million tests a day as a result in the space of 6 months. I would not have thought that possible, but when it became necessary, it was. We figured out how to bring our clinical trial networks together and have them work in an efficient way, whereas they'd pretty much been on parallel paths and not talking to each other. We figured out how to prioritize therapeutics when we had 600 ideas and we couldn't do clinical trials on 600 therapeutics. How do you do that in a fashion that collects the ideas from everybody? We learned how to do that. We learned how to do this internationally in a very cohesive way so that we weren't tripping over each other or duplicating trials, and learning all the way along. All of those things I don't think we will unlearn. I do hope, in terms of resources and planning, we don't slip back into some complacency after a couple of years, because there's another pandemic coming. I don't know when, but I would be very surprised if we aren't faced with this again in the next decade or so. And I hope this experience will make us even better prepared the next time.
So let me just ask you, because I know you have to leave us, for any final thoughts that you'd like this audience of health journalists to take away, reflections on the virus, on this effort, on our role as journalists in informing the public. What's your message to us?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the remarkable work that you all have been doing. I watch the press carefully. My list of clips has multiplied by tenfold since COVID came along. So what used to take me, 5 or 10 minutes in the morning is now a lot longer than that, just to see what's been put out there. And the vast majority of it is really well done. You have educated yourself about the nitty-gritty. You figured out how to express it. You've gotten people informed as long as they're reading what you're writing. I'm worried that a lot of people aren't, that they're getting their information from other sources that may not be so reliable. Obviously, this is the time particularly to hit hard on those public health measures. And the fact that they're not just sort of nice ideas, there's data behind them. And that if you want to save lives, you need to adopt those. Otherwise, you may be the next super spreader that's going to cause terrible outcomes for people you care about. All of that's just got to be brought across over and over again. and done in a fashion that doesn't put down the people who are skeptical, because that is probably not the sort of thing that they will resonate with and want to hear more about, but actually gives a voice to those concerns so they can be listened to, addressed, considered, and then gradually addressed in terms of the most evidence-based approach that we can bring to it, which ultimately I do believe people are interested in having. So yeah, just keep that up. Keep this bright light of attention. Try to get the balance, as I am right now, between what is really exciting, unanticipated efficacy of 95% and a pace of scientific project that's never happened before, with the fact that we've got time yet before that helps you, and it's up to all of us to try, meanwhile, to stem the tide of terrible suffering and death that's happening all around us. Getting that right is going to be a challenge every day.
It's a challenge that we hope we can rise to. Dr. Francis Collins, thank you so much for spending some time with our members and with the people who watch this after the fact. I know you have to leave us now, but it was very, very kind of you to take this time to stop into our summit.